what you brilliantly summarize in your book and just now, this has profound implications then on the lives of every Canadian, let alone every person in Western civilization and beyond. This wokeism is really a full frontal attack on many of the basic freedoms and assumptions and norms that we have a society that's enabled not only our freedom but our prosperity. I mean, that's not an overstatement, is it?
It isn't an overstatement. I mean, there are the proportion of people saying they're afraid for their jobs and reputations for what they have said in the past or might say in the future is much higher now than it was during Red Scare in the 1950s. Canada, I think Canada is in one of the worst positions of any society for a number of reasons. One of which is there is not an established right of center media, and there's a weaker conservatism in the culture, and therefore it's less balanced. In Britain, the press, for example, the newspaper market is much more balanced between right wing and left wing papers.
Mm-hmm.
In the US, you have more of a balance within the electronic media. In Canada, you have neither of those things. And not only that, because of the post 60s decline of the British Empire, when Canadian identity was recrystallizing, it came at a time when you had the new left rising initially from the United States. Ideas coming out of the new left around identity politics found their way into, for example, the 1971 Multiculturalism Act, the
Mm-hmm.
Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which allows for racial discrimination. And we've seen now, initially, that may not have been used, but what we're seeing now is it's increasingly being used. You have naked race and sex discrimination in ads for Canadian academic jobs. You have naked
Mm-hmm.
racial discrimination in court judgments. If you're Aboriginal or Black, you will get a lighter sentence. So justice is not blind. So the violation of equal treatment is, in fact, in the DNA of the Canadian Charter of Rights. So I just think the Canadian situation is worse than others because the courts are not providing a check. Whereas I think that in the US, because of the nature of the First Amendment and the court system,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
in Britain, still, I think the judiciary is less corrupted than the Canadian judiciary. And the problem is, if you can't even rely on the courts to back up, if you've been cancelled by your employer, for example, or if, like Jordan Peterson had his psychology license revoked for not tipping his hat to DEI ideology, the courts are upholding all of these discriminatory practices in Canada, and they are not in other jurisdictions. So Canada's in a really, really big hole. The other thing is the sort of truth and reconciliation based Indigenous issue, assault on the legitimacy of the Canadian state, I think is also more severe than, let's say, equivalent narratives about the United States being, implicated in
Mm-hmm.
slavery, and it's just, yes, it's there, but I think there's a check on it in the U.S. case that is more robust, whereas in the Canadian case, I don't see much. And you can't have a society. I mean, immigrants can't integrate into a society that hates
Mm-hmm.
itself. So I don't know how Canada digs itself out of that. Which, let's face it, the Trudeau government is really the government that presided over the
Mm-hmm.
entrenchment of these ideas. But I'm just not. You haven't heard a lot from Polyev. You've heard a bit on Remembrance Day, but you haven't heard a lot of
Mm-hmm.
things that might push back against that and try and sort of resuscitate the legitimacy of John A. Macdonald, of Canadian history. And
Mm-hmm.
until that happens, I'm afraid, I think Canada is going to be in a really bad place.
Indeed. I think you're onto something, Eric. And part of what this discussion rises for me is the whole notion of who really enables this radical extremist progressivism. Like you think of, I think you allude to fear being a very important emotion, careerism, but the whole aspect of groupthink where people go along with a crowd and really are very afraid to speak up and have courage and say, no, this is nonsense. I mean, to just simply start transforming people's gender and not really focused on their health is just antithetical to any common sense. So, what's enabling this from a sociological point of view based on your research?
Well, there's two things. One is what you describe as fear, which is sometimes known as preference falsification, where under communism, for example, many people didn't believe in it, but they'd still put the slogans on their shop windows. Um, in order not to be persecuted, and so there is a certain herd mentality, but more than that, and I think this is what I talk about in my book, is that race, sex, sexuality have become elevated as the taboos in society.
Mm.
So the highest values in society are anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-homophobia. So these become the highest values, and so if there's even a whiff that you might not be on the right side of those values, your reputation, people will see you as radioactive, and you can suffer what John McWhorter would call social death. And that's just very intimidating to a lot of people. So that's number one. But I don't think that's the whole story. I don't think just intimidation is the whole story. I think a lot of people actually truly believe.
No, I think you're absolutely right. So this is what we're referring to as we kind of wind up this far-reaching conversation, Eric, is the big intervention, and you line that up in terms of, I think, a brilliant 12-point plan, and certainly this is part of it. But I think you've also nailed, hit the head on the nail, so to speak, where you talk about the need for the political leadership of this country to successfully link culture with very important issues that affect people's Canadians' lives and use that as a basis to change these institutions and change it by making that kind of intervention that you talk about. So I think that's a really important insight into the political process.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would also really need, I also think we really need to focus on school reform. I know that's a provincial matter, but I
Mm-hmm.
think it's absolutely critical. I mean, most young people already, their political views are already formed by the time they set foot on campus. We know that younger people are more intolerant than, if you take a young leftist, they're a lot more intolerant than an older leftist of speech which might offend, for example. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Canada hasn't yet started going there in any serious way, the way the American red states have. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
going to be school reform. I think has to be number one on the list.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Education matters, culture matters. So, Eric, my final question to you is what role do citizens play in this?
Yeah, I mean, really, I'm kind of a proponent of both and. So we need to reform institutions, and actually elected government, which is the only institution that the majority of the population can control most of the time or occasionally. You've got to use elected government. I know there are libertarians who think that it's all down to citizens in the market. I'm afraid that that'll work for some things like podcast media where there's low barriers to entry and new entrants. The Joe Rogans and Jordan Petersons can suddenly have large followings, but it doesn't work that way for schools. It doesn't work that way for universities and tech firms. And so you need to use government. That's one of the big themes of my book is conservatives have to become classical liberals have to become used to using government. And now
Mm-hmm.
citizens, yeah, what can they do? I mean, of course, they're, to the extent they can speak out against the madness, to resist new buzzwords, like settler. To the extent you can resist these buzzwords, resist them. To the extent you can get involved at school board level, you know, get involved. I would say one of the problems is that those on the radical left punch like 5 times above their weight in many of these self selecting bodies and on social media. So we need these sort of average citizen, the normal person, to be more involved in trying to change their society and not be so passive and just worry about their, of course, you have to worry about your own family and your own, paying the bills. That's natural. You can't take chances necessarily that are going to result in you losing your job. I get that. But I guess where you feel that you can take a chance, or maybe if you're nearing retirement, I guess for those people to speak out, I think is very important. So there's a big role for the citizenry because really in the long term, even if we manage to get governments to reform the institutions, if we lose the battle of ideas in civil society, then ultimately those whatever progress we make in reforming the institutions will just be undone by a future administration. So we need to have change occurring within the citizenry, and of course, there's many ways that that's happening. One of the ways that is happening, one of the encouraging things, is that social media, podcasts, alternative media, new media are actually allowing many citizens to get different points of view from the mainstream media, which in Canada tends to be relatively compromised. And so that's allowing fresh viewpoints in, and I think it's making a difference, particularly with younger people. So there's a significant group of young Canadians who reject this nonsense. And I don't think that would have been possible without the internet.
I think you're right on. So, Eric Kaufmann, author of The Third Awokening, thank you for waking us up about the urgent need for this intervention for our country. And I want to thank you for your leadership and your courage.
Thanks so much, David. It's been a pleasure.
Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.